Okay, Mad World, it's Coach Sess. I'm going to give you my preliminary thoughts on the fight between Max Holloway and Brian Ortega, which is scheduled for UFC 226. So we have Holloway coming in as the champion at 145, and Ortega, who's just been on fire since he's entered the UFC, pretty much has entered going on a tear, finishing all of his opponents with the exception of one where it was the decision was reversed back to a no contest because he was later found to have some type of substance in his system. But other than that, he's pretty much finished all of his opponents since being in the UFC, and that's important because the UFC represents the highest level of competition. And prior to him entering the UFC, he had a few decisions. And I think that was because he was just discovering who he was and trying to figure out, his style, trying to come up with his identity inside the cage. And now that he's found it, he's earned himself pretty much a title shot. And he's done it in impressive fashion, especially coming off his last fight against Frankie Edgar and being the first man to finish Frankie Edgar. So that says a lot and gives him a lot of credibility to be that guy to fight the man. And Max Holloway, his last win is over Jose Aldo. 2 wins, in fact, both by KO. Very similar KOs in the same way. And prior to that, Pettis and Ricardo Lamas by decision. And the thing that you want to look at in this fight is pretty much, the methods that each guy is going to take or utilize to win this particular fight. Max is 5'9", and Ortega's about 5'9". Neither guy's really fought bigger than 145. I do have here in my notes that Max is going as heavy as 149. So these are really natural 45ers, and this is going to be a very entertaining fight. I think the common opponent that they had was Cub Swanson, and Ortega just stopped him a little sooner. That's the only thing that I could come up with. I don't think that's a make or break deal type fight that says the guy who did it faster or the guy who did it better is going to win that fight. So this is a very tight fight, very close fight to look at. I think that one thing that I paid attention to was experience. Max is going to have about 4 years more of experience and definitely more UFC fights. And Max in his last 12 fights or so, he's just been terribly hard to take down, which is not a factor for this fight because Ortega doesn't necessarily go in to take guys down, but he does allow himself to get taken down from some of the fights that I watched.
Speaking of impressive, let's talk about your jiu-jitsu. Now, you've been striking a lot recently, but you've got some of the best jiu-jitsu, frankly, in the UFC in terms of how functional it is for MMA. What is it that you get about MMA jiu-jitsu that a lot of your contemporaries don't seem to?
Well, there's the aspect, right? Because you have to have 2 switches. One is I should be able to go into a competition like Buchecha and Hodger, and I should be able to perform well with the rules given there and the moves that I can have. But when you go on the fight perspective, now there's another switch where there's a lot of things you can't do based on the fact that there's punches going through your face. So you have to look at jiu-jitsu in a different angle, and you have to go more to the Elio Gracie fundamentals, right? Which was a fight for your life. How can you be down there being efficient, but yet causing the most damage causing and inflicting as much damage as you can? And I think because of the philosophy, how I grasped the philosophy, and incorporated it with my own game, it made me who I am today.
Ryan Hall has often said the difference is, if you go to pure jiu-jitsu, they're complied. They have to use jiu-jitsu as well. But in MMA, they're not complied to use it. You have to find a way to force them to be under your duress. Is that the same idea that you have as well?
Absolutely, and this forces everyone.
So the striking, how come, I mean, I get it, right? You're a young guy. Each fight, the striking gets better and better. You had the big base in jiu-jitsu, so you don't need to necessarily dramatically improve that. But is it as simple as that you got this new toy, you want to drive it around?
It's not even that. It's just like every fight starts standing up. Wrestling gets pretty tiring. You know, you don't want to be the guy shooting in, and then gassing your arms out. And what happens to a lot of people who are just purely jiu-jitsu based is they spend all their energy trying to take someone down, and when they're unsuccessful, now their hands are heavy and they're getting punched in the face without being able to properly defend themselves. So my whole thing is let's bang a little bit, and through that chaos, then maybe I can seize the opportunity to grab a takedown or see something, you know, and that's it, man. You know, like I just strike and they take me down, and then welcome to my world.
But that's because he has a very active guard. He does not linger in his guard, and he looks for the submissions as soon as possible. I won't say right away, but as soon as possible, he starts to look for the submissions. And one of the things that you notice when you watch a lot of Ortega fights back to back is that he does a good job at pressuring his opponents. And so by the time the third round finalizes, his opponent is ready to succumb to his pressure, and their output starts to drop off a little bit. Now that's very important because Holloway is known for his output, known for his volume. So we don't know if he's going to be able to keep up the volume that he's normally used to for about 5 rounds. So he would have to keep this volume up roughly, just based on averages. He would have to keep this up 150 strikes, and that's just overall volume. At least 150 strikes per round, you know, or average out to that over the course of 5 rounds to keep Ortega from breaking him down. And because he's never really shown any signs of fatigue, then it's quite believable that he's going to be able to do that. Now, Ortega does not have a lot of volume, and that might be his undoing if he starts off with this slow pace and takes a lot of abuse in the beginning. And that's important because Holloway has such a high volume, and nobody that Ortega's has faced has the same level. Nobody's really brought the same level of volume for him to face. And so if he starts out with this slow pace and get beat up in the first 3 rounds, he may himself succumb to Holloway's power, or he may just find himself lagging in the fight and it going 5 rounds. I personally believe that it is going to go 5 rounds. I think because Ortega's submission threat and his counterfighting ability, that he's going to have the ability to keep Ortega, or always have the ace in his back pocket to always threaten the fight and take it away from Holloway. So that's going to cause Max to be a little smarter in this fight and to sit back, and the fight's just going to go 5 rounds just based on his counterfighting ability. If you pay attention to Ortega, his counterfighting ability is next level genius. There are about 4 or 5 stages to me in terms of counterfighting, and if you watch him, he masters all 4 or 5 stages. Everything from being able to strike with his opponent, everything from pressuring his opponent without any strikes. He doesn't really pressure that well against the cage because he doesn't have a lot of takedown output. But I think what he does is just really put his body into situations where he wears his opponent out. And then somehow, I'm not quite certain what's going on in the opponent's head, but somehow they feel something, they recognize something that the kid is coming on, and they end up running backwards, especially by the 3rd round.
You know, once you join the UFC, you're a professional athlete of the top level. And one thing that we really do take serious is our training. And my coach James and Henry Gracie always say all the time that you always have to stay ready because you're a gunslinger. Simple as that, you're a gunslinger. And you know, coming off this great victory, and thank you Thiago Tavares for the opportunity to fight. And we came out, you know, victorious, and it was well because although we took it on a month notice, we've always been training every day. I have no days, you know, no days off, literally. I train 6 days, Sunday's free, and we do a hike or we go surf or we go do something. So I'm always constantly moving, always staying active, and I feel that because you're a professional athlete, you have to keep that. I'm trying to climb to the top, and since I'm trying to climb to the top, there's no room for error. And when you fight, either you're gonna have a ghost of all the junk food that you ate, or you're not. So coming into this sport, especially after this big win, I especially have to focus everything now.
And like I stated before, Ortega has an unusual amount of finishes in the third round. Now, the third round's always been important for me because when you're able to finish in the late rounds, that means you're bringing some type of power with you. That's always an indicator. We may not be able to recognize and identify what that power is, what that power structure is, but it's there. And you see it in boxing when you see fighters who, you know, pretty much can, you know, sustain the abuse, work under firepower, and then in the 9th, 10th, and 11th, 12th round, you know, knock out their opponents and do it in on a repetitive basis. And that's what Ortega has. And I know the question of 5 rounds is going to come up, but Ortega has gone 5 rounds as a pro in a previous organization in the RFA. And the RFA has always been a feeder system for the UFC, at least until they merged with LFA. So now that system is a merger for, a feeder system for the UFC. So he has gone the distance of 5 rounds and still brings that type of pressure and against that level of competition. Maybe at the beginning stages of a UFC level competition, but he is able to bring that power. He is able to bring that force, that counter fighting style. So I see him doing something amazing in this fight if he can keep his composure and not get beat up too much. I think one of the things he has to add to his game, whenever we see Max Holloway in trouble, he has to go to the leg kicks. If we look at fights where Max has lost, or fights where guys were able to go the distance with Max, or keep Max from, you know, turning the power on, the one thing that they were able to do was either outkick Max Holloway, or they threw enough kicks that slowed him down. Now, Ortega hasn't shown the propensity to do a lot of leg kicks, so I just might be speaking without any validity here when I say that he needs to go to leg kicks, because you don't just go into the gym and start throwing leg kicks against a kicker like Holloway. If he can make a mistake and break his leg, but that is one thing that I've seen that has been very useful. I don't know how much he's going to bring that to the fight, but it's there. It's there to be used. It's just a matter of, you know, if he uses it and what can he use it for. One of the things I did was I looked at the last 3 opponents, and because they have so many fights, it was just be next to impossible for me to get all this data. But in the last 3 opponents, which is important because that's usually the last 3 opponents you fought almost in a year's time, and that's pretty much who you are for the next fight. It's the last 3 guys that you fought. That's who you are. That's what you're used to, the pressure you're used to. So the last 3 opponents collectively, Max has been under the pressure. He's fought opponents who've had 19 KOs collectively and 16 submissions between the 3 of them. That's what he was always facing. Whenever he stepped inside of the cage, he's always faced that threat. He's always faced that danger. And he's always been able to overcome it by either knocking the opponent out or finishing the opponent or getting a decision. Ortega's last 3 opponents collectively have 15 KOs and 16 submissions together. So he's used to that threat as well. And that's very important, considering that a lot of times we'll look at guys pretty much who are submission guys, and we like to think that it's just a matter of time before they run into that one striker or that guy with the finishing ability, where he's been under that pressure, he's been under that fire. So I think he's going to be able to survive Max in the fight, because Max only has about 8 wins by KO and 5 wins by decision, and 5 wins by decision and 2 by submission. So and since and that's in the UFC. His record overall is in the UFC is 15-3. So I think that Ortega has about 50-50. He's 3 wins by KO and 3 wins by submission. But I think the real secret to his wins is his pressure and his ability to counterfight. Like I said, he's just a genius at this. So that's my initial take on the fight. I'm just going to do a little bit more digging as each week passes till we get to the fight itself. Not saying who's going to win right now. Some interesting details between both fighters. I think it's an interesting fight. I don't think that usually I like to go with experience as being a deciding factor, but there's just some other details I need to look at. I think the experience is important in this fight, just from a mental point of view, but I don't think it's important from a physical point of view in terms of quality of opponents and the style. So I'll do some more digging, I'll do some more investigating, and give you my findings. Until then, you've had words with the Mad Coach.